Hello, welcome to Old Stuff Show. I'm very excited about this show today. We're looking at sheet music of the past. And before we get started with that topic, I just wanted to mention a comment that was sent to me by one of our watchers, and it's a very important point that is made when we look at a topic like sheet music, for example. DiMatteo says, "Thank you, sir. I don't know much about postcards, but I enjoyed listening to you talk about them." And I hope that that's the kind of spirit and attitude that people will take when they're looking at some of my videos. They may not know a lot about it. It's a great opportunity to learn and to enjoy. So that's how I approach the sheet music today. To be really honest with you, I am not musical. I'm anything but musical. I suppose you could say I don't know a fiddle from an oboe. But anyway, I really enjoy looking at sheet music of the past because to me they're historical documents. There's so much we can learn from sheet music of the past. For example, we can look at social values of the times. We can look at lifestyle, fashion, language. These are very significant things that I'll point out to you as we go through this. Today we're looking at part one of sheet music as a mirror of society. Part two we'll look at specifically World War I and World War II. But in part one we're going to look at the first half of the 20th century and go from there. So, and also, just before we get started, I also want to let you know that I have something to share with you that I think you might be interested in. When we look at sheet music, we're also looking at pianos. And there is a piano museum here in Ontario, in Napanee, the Canadian Piano Museum. And something that I'm sure any of you who have an interest, if you're in that area, would enjoy considerably. This, for example, is one of the items that's in that museum. And here's another one. And this one is really interesting because it's quite ornate. So the Canadian Piano Museum in Napanee, well worth a visit. So thinking about pianos, in the first half of the 20th century, nearly every family had a piano. It was just something that was the center of family activity, especially on Sundays. After church, the family would gather around the piano, and with the sheet music, they would have a sing-song together, and that was standard for those days. Proof of the popularity of the piano was that in my area in southern Ontario, there were over 20 piano making factories in the first half of the 20th century, and the last one remaining was in 1989. Sheet music and the use of sheet music and the piano declined in the 20s, partly because of the automobile. People, I suppose, were more interested after church going for a joyride than they were looking at or singing around the piano. But anyways, as time went on, we move into the 50s and 60s and dwindled considerably. So at the start of the 20th century, the main driving force of popular music and sheet music was something called Tin Pan Alley. This was a name given to the New York publishers and writers of songs who, for commercial purposes, were pumping them out quite a lot. And the most significant individual at that time was Irving Berlin. Now, Irving Berlin dominated this scene by putting out some 2,000 pieces of sheet music. And in the beginning, he made 1 cent for each copy that he sold, and in 1910, he actually made $100,000. So you can imagine how many pieces of sheet music were sold. But then he was smart, and he realized that if he wrote both the lyrics and the melody, he would double that. So he did that, and he made a lot of money doing it. Irving Berlin is maybe mostly known for songs like White Christmas, putting on the Ritz. Easter Parade, those of you who are into the music scene would recognize those. This one I don't recognize myself, but it's got a very interesting cover, My Sweetie. Songs like I Want to Go Back to Michigan, Down on the Farm. So if you look up on Google Irving Berlin, you'll see hundreds of songs that you might recognize. So that's quite a legacy for him to leave with us. As far as looking at the age of sheet music, if you look in the bottom left of the inside page, you'll see the date when it was published. And the problem is they're in Roman numerals, but if you don't know how to do Roman numerals, you can look it up. If we look at the early part of the 20th century, songs, now this is one of my favorite songs for learning purposes as historical document. This one is called Call Me Up Some Rainy Afternoon. And what's so neat about this is that it's a simple little song, but it has so many interesting messages. So the background to this is there's a young man and a young woman. They were together. They met each other and just met each other. And he walked her home, and then he said he'd like to see her again. And she says, call me up some rainy afternoon, and I'll arrange for a quiet little spoon. Well, spoon, there's a good example of language right there, a term in those days for affection. And then she says, think of all the joy and bliss, we'll hug and we can, and then the Victorian values pop in, talk about the weather, so we couldn't use anything suggestive there now, could we? And then she carries on, says, mum's the word when we meet, be a mason, don't repeat. That also talks a little bit about the time period, because the Masonic lodges were well known then, and the secrecy of the lodges were important in those days. So kind of a neat little song. You get a sense of values there, you get a sense of language, you get a sense of custom, and that's just one example to start off with here. And sometimes when there was a big event, like the Titanic, when it went down, yeah, just as sure as anything, out came a piece of sheet music, and just as the ship went down, the Song of the Sea became popularized, and people bought it and talked about it together, and that was an important vehicle to do that through the sheet music. Also, in the early part of the century, you would have a piece of music like "Oh, You Beautiful Doll." The thing about this piece is it shows the artwork, and then this artwork, of course, shows the style of the day, the hat, and then if you combine that with this one, "That's How I Need You," then we've got the hat and the hairdo. You get a sense of what kind of fashion and style was. What it was like in those days, but that's through sheet music, and that's why I say it's a historical document. You can get a sense of what these people were like and how they lived and what they were thinking, all about the values of the day. And then even children, like if you look at these are kindergarten songs and games, but what's interesting there is you get a sense of the kind of clothing that they were wearing at the turn of the century as well. So these, to start off here, have given us something to look at, and the big question is, why do people, collect sheet music? For me, it's the historical part of it. For others who like music and are musical, then they look at it for the music itself and the melody and the lyrics. Some people are interested just in the graphics and the artwork, and I've seen these sell just for people to put in a frame and display. So the artwork had value itself. So now if we move to the 1920s, we can get a sense of the Roaring Twenties. So the alcohol was in style here, of course, and Show Me the Way to Go Home is an example of someone who wasn't too sober, and there's songs written about people that showed up in society like that. Another one of the roaring 20s was Yes Sir, That's My Baby, and you get a good sense of the fashion style of the 1920s at that time as well. The hopes and dreams of people in the 20s, you know, California, Here I Come, another green pasture far away, and people could dream about that and the fun and success they could have there. I include this one, it's a picture of Mary Pickford, only because Mary Pickford is from the area that I live in here, and I've been to a cemetery nearby that has her mausoleum. It's probably the biggest one in the cemetery. So she was a famous movie star, and she's buried right here in my own community here. So again, back to the piano. We talked about the companies. There were in the 20 common names like the Heinzman and Company. So that would be one that people would know about. This one is kind of neat. It's Williams and Son. It's got, look at the old piano and the cover there, and this one, Karn piano is King. The Nordheimer piano, and then again back to the one that I think a lot of people who are into the music scene would recognize, the Heinzman name. So that continued on all the way through many decades in the first part of the 20th century. Now when we get to the 30s, I don't have any examples here of the 30s music, but the ones that I have seen in the past really do talk about the Depression. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Prosperity's just around the corner. So what people were thinking, what people's situation was reflected in the music very clearly, and that's why looking at it as a as a way of looking at the values of the time is a good way through the historical document of sheet music. Another part of the 20s and or before the 20s, just before the 20s, was the Temperance Movement. It actually started in the 1870s. The 1878 there was a Temperance Act passed, and in Canada here, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union pushed the whole idea of abstaining from alcohol, and it had its ups and downs, but it declined by the end of World War I. And in the 20s in Canada, it pretty well was not effective at all. But during the time period when this was the WCTU would push young Canadians to not drink, and there's a bit of a propaganda aspect to it here. Here's a song in that booklet, My Resolve, and the young kids are being taught to sing, I will not taste one drop of beer, whatever people say, I want my brain to be all clear for lessons, work, and play, and all kinds of songs in this booklet that the temperance people were pushing. And the anti-saloon campaigns, the same kind of thing. But it didn't last, and it was something they tried, and the times changed the whole idea of the values of the day, and by the 20s, then that was gone. There's another thing that is out there in terms of sheet music, and there's lots of sheet music related to racism. I don't have any examples here, but there were some pretty significant race type things with black people, with Chinese people, and so on, both in artwork and in lyrics of songs, and it was just part of the values of the day, and certainly some people collect that type of thing as well. So when you get into the 50s, after the war, and we will look at that separately, as I said, you've got rock and roll, you've got all the songs now that are being put out in different forms of entertainment, the long play records, the 45 records, and then as the the decades after that progressed. There's all kinds of technology that sheet music wasn't necessary anymore, but it did hang around for a while. For example, this is one from the 60s, which was a time of peace and love, and all the world needs now is love. So it's it hung around a bit, but people do collect it today, and they like to play it. And I have people always asking me for sheet music and looking through my bundles of sheet music that I have, and I'll offer some of that for you on my eBay site. Values of sheet music really range from maybe $2. I've seen them go up to $10, $15, depending on how old and what the graphics are and how unusual they are. So this is what we're talking about in the mirror of society. We've seen a lot of things just from the few pieces of sheet music that I've shown you that can work together to act as social documents and historical documents, and as I said, it's a mirror of society. So we're going to do the same with World War I and World War II. The pictures and the words in those songs that I'll show you for part 2 show the people's attitudes towards the wars, their feelings about patriotism, and all of these things again as historical documents. So this is all I have for today. We'll carry on with part 2 next week, and I hope that you've learned something and enjoyed it. And remember to subscribe, that's important. And we'll see you next Friday for part 2. And I have to tell you something about my grandfather. My grandfather once told me to be musical, and I wasn't sure what he meant, but I listened, and then he says, B sharp and C sharp. I always remember that, so I'll say the same thing to you, B sharp and C sharp. Bye for now.